Good morning to you all, and a very warm welcome to this very special edition of Shabbat at the House. In case you're new to our group, the House is a house church, and we often get together on Saturdays for what is called Shabbat at the House. You are currently watching this on our official YouTube channel, so if you'd like to subscribe, then you'll be alerted to future events and uploads as well. Please also feel free to consult and follow our social media accounts on Facebook and Instagram. There we post what's happening and when. My name is Natalie Kendel. I will be your host for today, and here's a bit of what you can expect during your time with us this morning. As mentioned, today is a special edition of Shabbat at the House because this week falls on Easter weekend, or as we call it, Passover. Tomorrow, on Sunday, it is Easter Sunday or Resurrection Day, where we celebrate and remember the resurrection of Jesus and the hope that contains. Thus, today on Shabbat represents the day after the Friday crucifixion, where Jesus lay in the tomb after having been killed. Often on Easter Sunday, there is an air and message of life and celebration and new hope among Christians, as it should be. Today, we are going to make room for something else too, for lament. It isn't news that there is much sorrow and loss in the greater world, for us personally, in our communities. And this loss may look differently to each of us. We might carry it in different ways. But whatever we're carrying, it is right and good to make room for that sorrow and allow time for expression and remembering, because many people aren't just standing cheering like on Sunday morning. For some, future hope doesn't look that clear, or the present is so painful, or past events weigh so heavily. They may still very much be sitting in the darkness and mourning like on the day of Shabbat before Resurrection Sunday. Therefore, this Shabbat at the house will be a Shabbat making space for mourning and for lament. We're going to sing together. We will explore a story found in the book of Lamentations, and we will have a minute of remembrance and meditation for those who have experienced loss in this year or further back. To start us off, we are going to be singing a song called God of Every Hour, and the lyrics will be on the screen if you'd like to sing along.
You are God of every hour, every part of the road ahead. In the night of deep confusion and the morning filled with
I'd like to take this opportunity to mention that the house has created a Spotify playlist called Passover Songs. It contains carefully picked songs for Passover, about the Passover, songs we love which tell the Easter story. For those who wish to enjoy these songs during this Passover weekend, you can find the link below in the description. The playlist will be available for the next week. But for now, we dive into our story for this week. Our story today is found in the book of Lamentations, chapter 5. There are many stories in the Bible about victims. Stories of people who were blamed for things that wasn't their fault, people who lost all they had, people who were oppressed by cruel rulers, who found no justice in the court of law, who were betrayed by their own family, even people who appear to be suffering for no apparent reason except the random chaos in the world. And it is in the suffering of these victims that laments might arise, expressions of sorrow. How long? Why, Lord, they ask, when will you defend me? Such calls might deeply resonate with the voice in our own hearts today. Similarly, the name of the book of Lamentations in Hebrew is Echa. Echa means how. One of the common responses human beings have to suffering is to ask questions. Why? How? And the book of Lamentations is indeed titled in the form of a question. Now, many of us may be familiar with the book of Lamentations, but just to make sure we're on the same page, here's a bit of context. The author of Lamentations is a prophet called Jeremiah, or in Hebrew, Yirmeyahu. Jeremiah was only a teenager when he was first called by God. He was the son of a priest and became known over the years in the kingdom of Judah as the weeping prophet. His calling in general consisted of warning God's people about the coming destruction of Jerusalem and their exile to the land of Babylon. And he shared this same message for 40 years. For 40 years, Jeremiah talked about the king of Babylon and his armies destroying the capital city and taking many of its people captive to Babylon. And nearly everyone laughed and mocked him, because at the time Jeremiah began sharing this message from God, Egypt was still the superpower in the world, not Babylon. It was like a prophet today insisting that Czechoslovakia is going to conquer the whole world next year. As a youth, God asked Jeremiah to first walk through the whole country of Judah. He said, Go to the towns, the villages, look at how my people are living. See what they're doing to each other. Discover for yourself what the problem is and why I need to stop it. Why things can't go on as they are. So the teenager walks through the country, and he sees for himself how his own people are sacrificing their infants to the pagan god Molech, making other Israelite slaves without chance of release, oppressing the poor, mistreating women, and ignoring the weakest in society, starving and vulnerable widows and orphans, foreigners, and those financially vulnerable. It is a country corrupt to the core. And as we, as readers, discover more and more of the context of the exile, we can begin to see, as Jeremiah did, that this story isn't going to be like those other stories about innocent victims. It isn't going to be like Hannah asking for God to save her from the societal humiliation of not having children, or Joseph being imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. We aren't going to hear a tale of innocent victims crying out to God for restitution, because in this story, the victims are the guilty ones. Now, how do you navigate a story like that, where the sufferers are the villains? Well, the story carries on. After teenage Jeremiah had walked for months and seen the truth around him, he begins speaking to the people, to the Judean nobility, to the king, and so on. And after those 40 years of ministry, everything God said would happen, happened. A warlord prince called Nebuchadnezzar, which no one had heard of, swept across the land, conquering city after city, country after country. The Egyptian army was finally beaten by Babylon's, and then, in 587 BC, Jerusalem too was taken. The book of Lamentations was written following this fall and exile of Judah, in which Jeremiah, as a witness, stands in the ruins of the city of Jerusalem, and he takes stock of what's happened. He expresses the feelings which come from loss. In chapter 5, verse 7, the prophet expresses that God has dealt justly with his people, who had become worse, more violent, more oppressive, and corrupt than all the neighboring nations around them. They who were meant to be an example of what God's love and justice looks like when it plays out in a human community. But things had gotten so bad in Judah that a foreign conquering ruler is used as a tool to help, as a relieving interruption for those suffering within Judah's own borders. As we said, this story is a strange story indeed, a lament about guilty victims. And as readers, we can't help but wonder, after all that's been lost and broken and torn down, how is there any hope to be found? And Jeremiah too looks around him and in his lament asks the title of this book, How? How did this happen? How could this come to be? Well, to answer the question, we're going to explore the final chapter of Lamentations, the 5th chapter of the book. Lamentations is in essence made up of 5 poems of lament, and the 5th poem or chapter is like a summary of the previous chapters. In it, the prophet is poetically telling us what Judah has lost. Let us begin reading in Lamentations chapter 5 from verse 15 to 18. Jeremiah says, "Joy has vanished from our hearts. Our dancing has turned into mourning. The crown has fallen from our heads. Woe to us, for we have sinned. This is why our hearts are sick. This is why our eyes grow dim. It's because of Mount Zion, so wasted that jackals have overrun it." In Lamentations, Jeremiah describes the psychological and emotional condition of the Jewish people, and he mentions 3 great losses they have suffered. Let's go through them now one at a time. The first loss is the loss of joy. In verse 15, Jeremiah says Israel has lost its joy. But this is to be understood as more than a loss of a happy mood. Losing joy also insinuated losing praise, and the hope that drives that celebration. Some Christians today may use the phrase, "praise God through the storm," and in saying this, they insinuate that praising God can turn around a difficult situation, and sometimes that the joy which leads to praise ought to be enacted even in difficult times. But here, the people's joy is described as being gone, and their dance is described as having turned into mourning. They didn't have anything to praise about. A bitter sorrow has robbed them of their joy. That meant there would be no more singing of David's psalms in the temple, or playing of the harp or the tambourine in the royal courts. The praise team wouldn't be practicing for worships on Friday nights. So the first loss is the loss of joy. The second loss described by the author is the loss of crown. In verse 16, when Jeremiah talks about this loss, he refers to it as the crown fallen from our heads. Now, since the time God had made David king, there had been a bloodline of kings in Judah. But now Babylon has removed Israel's monarchy. They don't have a king anymore, nor autonomy of power. Even their noblemen, which Daniel, his family, and friends were members of, had been taken away to Babylon. In other words, Israel no longer has official rulers. No structure or power or authority to look to for guidance or leadership during these tumultuous times. And since Jeremiah describes crowns and heads as our and in plural, it seems as though not only is the physical royal throne in Judah empty, but each individual's crown and glory has been lost. And the third loss is the loss of Mount Zion. Mount Zion was the name of the hill Jerusalem lay on. It was sometimes used as an alternative name for the capital city of Judah. Now, everything on that hill had been burned to a crisp. But was Jeremiah talking about a few buildings being destroyed, or the destruction of a mere landmark? No, this wasn't like the Eiffel Tower burning down or a pyramid collapsing. Jeremiah is referring to Judah losing its temple. The temple in Jerusalem had been burned down and destroyed completely by the Babylonians. This is presented as the heaviest loss of all, the worst of the three. But why is that the case? Well, the temple was where God's presence was, where God dwelled among his people. The people went to the temple to pray. They went there to be close to God. The temple was also where someone could go if he was wrongly condemned for a crime in the courts of law. Traditionally, a man could climb the temple stairs, place his hand on the altar, and swear before God that he was innocent. The belief was that God would give a sign to back up and prove that this man was telling the truth or come to his defense. The temple was in more ways than one a sanctuary. And finally, the temple was where people sacrificed animals and asked for forgiveness for their sins. It was their connection to salvation. The temple was where the priesthood functioned, where they brought people's burdens to God. And now, that temple had been destroyed. So Lamentations chapter 5 unfolds a story of victims, guilty victims. But not only that, the story is about guilty people who have had their path back to forgiveness, back to reconnection with God, utterly destroyed. Imagine this from the people's point of view. They had done wrong, they had sinned, and now the bridge back to God had been seemingly burned to ashes. How can the people return to God if their connection to forgiveness is severed? But yet what's happening here in Lamentations 5? Why is Jeremiah, amidst the ruins of Jerusalem, still praying? What could he possibly have to say to God? What could he ask for? Why is he directing his mourning to God? Why is he addressing Adonai in these verses? If the prophet and his people had lost all joy, dignity, pride, power, autonomy, belongings, and seemingly also their access to forgiveness and to God's presence, why is Jeremiah praying to God for help? Well, let's have a look at what Jeremiah actually prayed. Lamentations 5:19-21. You, Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures through all generations. Why do you never remember us? Why abandon us for so long a time? Adonai, turn us back to you, and we will come back. Renew our days as they were in the past. Here, the first thing Jeremiah does is to praise God. The second thing is to call God King. The third is to ask God to help the people turn back to him. So in a time without joy, Jeremiah praises God. In a time with no king, he calls God the king. And in a time with no temple, Jeremiah asks God to help them and save them. It seems Jeremiah knows something. He remembers something about God that it seems his people had forgotten. He remembered that God is, 1, always worthy of praise, even when it cannot be done in emotional joy, because with God there is always hope. Not because God needs man's praise, but because God is always just and good and willing to help. Secondly, Jeremiah remembers God is always king. Even when all earthly structures of power and organization and leadership and systems have been dethroned or failed. And finally, Jeremiah remembered that not only will God forgive, but we humans are dependent on God to even want forgiveness, to even want something other than self-destruction. Again, going back to 5 verse 21, this is demonstrated by Jeremiah saying, "Turn us back to you that we may return to you." He is saying here that we can't even be sorry without your help, Lord. Without you working that in our hearts, we can't regret or change or want better things. And so, in a story of guilty victims, it is always God who makes the first move. It is Him who takes the initiative, who first reaches out to us, so we can then reach out to Him if we want to. Now, some of us have been told that we need to feel sorry in order to come to God for forgiveness and be accepted. But is this true? Can any of us ever really feel sorry enough for any sin to earn His forgiveness? Can our emotions make us deserve His forgiveness? No, we'll never be sorry enough. We can't earn His forgiveness, and we don't even fully understand the harm that we do. But this is the miracle in the story about guilty victims. Even when joy has been lost, power has been lost, and the path back to God has been seemingly lost, who God is has not been lost. Who He is cannot be lost. He remains who He is. And this is the secret, the key to why Jeremiah is still standing there praying to God. That's why he asks God for help. Because Jeremiah believes God is who He is. Even in a time without celebration, joy, singing, or dancing, He is the hope that gives us reason to still have joy. Even in a time without leadership, glory, or freedom, He is and remains the King. And even if the temple itself burns down and we've cut ourselves off from all help, He is still there willing to help. He is the path to forgiveness. When the people do not keep the covenant, God keeps the covenant. When they fail to be good in the world, He doesn't stop being good. This is what is so astounding about the story of the exile. Because it's hard to be innocent and persecuted. It's hard to be treated badly and to suffer when it's not your fault. It's actually easier to be an innocent victim than a guilty one. Because if you're suffering and it's your fault, where do you go? Who else can you blame? What hope do you have, and what case can you build? But the story of the exile shows that even people who are so guilty that they have the blood of their own children on their hands cannot change who God is, cannot wipe away His kindness, His justice, or erase His patience. They cannot delete His outreached helping hand. Nothing we can do, nothing we can say can change who God is. In a changing, violent, stormy world, a seamlessly hopeless situation, He is the one who will remain faithful to a relationship, to His promises. He is the one who persistently offers healing and new beginnings and better things. And He is the one who will never turn away someone who comes to Him. This is the hope in the book of Lamentations. In the face of exile and loss, of being uprooted and not seeing a clear or bright future, that even if you are guilty, God is the right place to go with that guilt, and He is the right place to turn that mourning towards. Because amid everything that you and I can lose in this world, we cannot lose who God is. He is our joy, our King, and our help. And when we call on Him, even if it is in the form of the confusion, frustration, and sorrow that makes up a lamentation, it will never be in vain. To conclude this thought, let us sing together Big Enough, the lyrics you'll find on the screen.
Is not God big enough to receive the doubt in us? Can't His presence room all human pain? Is not truth true enough to survive the lies in us? So whatever you may bring, God is big enough. Is not God big enough to receive the fear in us? Can't His heart accept a stumbling faith? Is not He strong enough to forgive the sin in us? So whatever you may bring, God is big enough. Are our questions threats to the answer Himself? Could we bring a thing to Him that would overreach His love? Is not God big enough to receive the dark in us? Can't His light envelop any shade? Is not He life enough to reverse the death in us? So whatever you may bring, God is big enough. He is big enough.
At this time, we are going to have a moment of quiet remembrance and meditation together. Whether you've lost someone close to you, or perhaps lost the life you had or wanted to have, maybe you're struggling with a loss of self or friends or hope, or are mourning over the destruction and war and death of the time we currently live in. Whatever it may be, let us allow space and time for that lament, knowing that anything we bring to God, whether of rage, sadness, despair, He is big enough to handle those things. Lord, we thank you that none of our questions or our anger or mourning are threats to you, that you are the right place to direct the full spectrum of our emotions and experiences. I'd like to pray for each person who's joined us today. You see the pain or struggle better than anyone else does. You're not put off by our doubts or insulted by the realness in any way, and you don't demand from us forced joviality or to plaster on smiles. But rather, on that Passover, you proved that you were willing to dive to the deepest darkness, the depths of human despair, just to sit with us, to bring a candle into the dungeons we occupy, the spaces of the lonely and the fearful and the mourning, and to show that there's nowhere you won't bring us light. There's nowhere you won't go to show us the way out. God, please bring comfort to each person here. Bring relief and acceptance of where they are, and help us to just hold on. Hold on to the hope and the promise you made that Jesus is the blueprint of your future plans for us. His resurrection will be our resurrection. His victory, our victory. May you raise our broken hearts and this broken world to life very soon. Amen. Thank you, each of you, for taking part in that moment of remembrance. We will finish off this morning with a song called Yet Still I Dare to Hope. The words of this song are taken directly from Lamentations chapter 3, where Jeremiah, though standing in the ruins of Jerusalem, says, "Yet still I dare to hope. When I remember this, the faithful love of the Lord never ends. His mercies never cease. Great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin afresh each morning. I say to myself, the Lord is my inheritance. Therefore I will hope in him." So let us sing this together, Yet Still I Dare to Hope.
I have seen affliction, hardship is my lot. I have been the target of the arrows from the bow, and my prayers unanswered. Though I shout and cry, enemies surround me, I have been so peace deprived. Yet still I dare to hope when I remember this. The faithful love of God, it never ends. His mercies never cease, and every dawn they're new. The Lord is my inheritance, the one who is my due. I will wait in quiet for the Lord to come and save. I will seek his presence even from an early age. And though my paths are crooked, been the prey of the For no one is abandoned by the Lord. He does not relish in our sorrow. And night will never last, the dawn will come. Because of the greatness of His love. Yet still I dare to hope when I remember this, the faithful love of God who never ends. His mercies never cease, and every dawn they're new. The Lord is my inheritance, the one who is my due. The Lord is my inheritance, the one who is my due. Yet still I dare to hope.
That's it from us here at Shabbat at the house. Thank you so much to each of you for sharing your time together with us this morning. I wish you all a meaningful week, and I hope that God's peace will be especially felt loudly and strongly this week. And I hope you are given space and time for exactly where you are as well. Shabbat Shalom. See you next time.